This lecture is on the specific emotion of stress. Stress is defined as appraising and responding to threats or challenges. And I want to talk specifically about this appraisal component. Remember that appraising is kind of like the cognitive label that you make from Schachter's two-factor theory. So the appraisal of the situation is how we think about the stress situation. And how we think about it, like we learned in the last lecture, dictates how we feel about the stress or how we experience the stress. Imagine that you have an exam, for example, coming up. If you perceive that exam as a threat, as something that's scary or too much for you to be able to do, then you're going to have the emotions of stress. You're going to be distracted from being able to study very well. As opposed to if you think about it as a challenge, sort of like a game that you're playing and trying to conquer. Then what happens is that instead you focus your attention quite effectively and you don't experience as much stress. So if you think about the things in your life that cause you stress, you'll be able to identify probably the places where you perceive them as threats. If you can change the way that you think based on Schachter's two-factor theory, then you can change the way that you experience a stress. So if you can talk yourself into considering them as challenges instead of threats, it'll decrease your stress. There are three major types of stressors. The first are daily hassles. These are things like going to the grocery store, making sure the kids' lunches are packed, getting the bills paid, and none of them cause too much stress in and of themselves, but when you combine the numerous daily hassles that we all deal with regularly, then it creates kind of a low-level, constant amount of stress. The next are significant life changes, and these are the things that cause moderate amounts of stress that last for a fair amount of time, but not an extended amount of time. So things like getting married or divorced, things like moving or changing jobs. And then catastrophes, which cause significant amounts of stress, very, very high levels. And these are things like losing a loved one, or if you had been in a natural disaster and lost your home in an earthquake, for example, that would all be a catastrophe. The way we talk about stress is as a response cycle, and the response cycle is called the general adaptation syndrome, which is a little strange because it makes it sound like it's a disease, and of course it's not. This is just how everybody responds to stress. And there are three phases. The first is the alarm reaction phase. This is what we often call the fight or flight response. So essentially something stressful happens, you perceive it as a threat, and your body goes into fight or flight, basically mobilizing resources to be able to deal with that threat. This stage usually is a short-lived stage, and then we move quickly into resistance, which is like coping. We have an extraordinary ability as a species to be able to cope with stressful situations, which is really good. And coping or resistance can last for a short amount of time or a very long amount of time, depending on what the stressor is. Sometimes, however, if you're coping and coping and coping and you've gotten to the point where you've utilized all of your resources, whether it's financial resources or emotional resources, you can come into a stage of exhaustion where you stop coping and it's kind of like a miniature crisis again. Oftentimes that will be short-lived and we'll go back into resistance or into coping again. So this is the cycle that we experience when we're experiencing stress. It might be short-lived or it might be long-term, depending on if you're talking about daily hassles, significant life changes, or catastrophes. So you might be wondering, can stress be good? And the answer to that is yes, it actually can be, but only if it's brief and comes in moderate amounts. Our systems have stress for a reason, and that is to help us deal with crises in the environment. But the system is set up so that those crises are few and far between. It's not set up for a situation where we're constantly having crisis after crisis after crisis. It's really not set up for the situation where we have all these daily hassles. So this Yerkes-Dodson Law kind of shows how stress works. We'll talk about stress down on the bottom as arousal, and then performance on the left, how well you are functioning in life or on a particular task. And let's use the example of an exam. If you have an exam coming up and you have low levels of stress, you're probably not going to be that nervous about the test, so you might not put in as much energy to study, which is probably going to lead you to not do as well as you would if you had cared a little bit more. On the other end of the extreme, if you have really high levels of stress about the exam, you might study, but you might not be studying particularly effectively. We oftentimes have a hard time learning new information when we're very stressed out. So that's probably also not going to lead to a very good performance. Or maybe you have anxiety when the test actually comes and it causes you to forget all of the things that you learned. That's another example of high arousal or too high of stress causing poorer performance. But here in the middle, around the medium stress, we actually get peak performance. So on an exam, a moderate amount of stress leads you to actually be motivated enough to do some studying, but not too stressed out that that studying was ineffective, thereby maximizing how well you're going to do on the exam. So stress can be useful. You probably have heard about type A personalities or type B personalities, and this is really a stress personality. Please read about each of these types in the book. One of the most important things that we can learn about when we talk about stress is the fact that the stress really impacts our body, and it does this in a couple of different ways. First and foremost, stress decreases the immune system's functioning, and this becomes really problematic because, as we noted before, in our current American lifestyles, we have constant stress from those daily hassles all of the time. So our immune system is constantly being suppressed, which causes us to have more illnesses. It causes us to heal more slowly when we have any kinds of diseases, and that's because stress causes white blood cell count to go down. In this image here, the white blood cells are attacking some kind of a foreign invader in the body, and that's their job, to get rid of things like bacteria and viruses. So if your immune system is suppressed, it's not going to be able to fight off infection quite as well. Additionally, stress causes heart disease. Heart disease is the #1 killer of people in the United States, and the more stress we have, the more of a problem that is in our culture. So it's actually quite bad for our body to be stressed out. You might feel like there are some people who deal with stress better than others, and researchers have started to look to see if there's a genetic component to that. There's some people who are genetically prone to stress while other people aren't. And in particular, they've identified this gene called the 5-HTT-LPR gene, oftentimes referred to colloquially as the depression gene. And the way genes work is, remember, you got one from your mom and one from your dad for each of the pairs you have. So what that means is that you have 2 alleles for each gene. An allele is just a small part on a chromosome. And in this particular gene, the alleles come in different sizes. So you could either have 2 long alleles, one long one from your dad and one long one from your mom. You could have a long-short combination, or you could have 2 short alleles, the short-short combination. And what research is starting to point to is it's the people who have genetically the short-short combination who are most prone to stress and who are most prone to depression. We don't really understand exactly why or how yet, but there does seem to be a genetic component. And of course, going back to the nature versus nurture issue, we could expect that there would be some genetic component and that there also are a lot of environmental influences.